There comes a moment, quiet and unannounced, when you realize the reflection in the mirror has changed. Lines trace stories you never asked for. Eyes carry a weight you hadn't noticed before. And suddenly, you find yourself standing at the threshold of a chapter you never imagined would arrive so soon. Aging. It arrives not as a storm, but as a gentle tide, rising little by little, reshaping the shores of your life. For many, this journey is met with resistance. We clutch to youth like sand slipping through our fingers, fearing what lies ahead. The body grows frail. Loved ones depart. The world, once familiar, feels distant. And the mind begins to wander through old memories like a traveler lost in fog. But what if we've misunderstood the nature of aging all along? What if, instead of a slow unraveling, it is a sacred invitation, a call to return to ourselves, to lay down the burdens we've carried for decades, the titles, the regrets, the unfinished plans, and step into a gentler, quieter wisdom that was always waiting? In Buddhist teachings, aging is not a tragedy. It's not an enemy to be conquered, nor a punishment to be endured. It is a teacher, a patient, persistent one. It strips away illusions and attachments, leaving only what is essential. And within this stripping away, there is an opportunity to touch the heart of impermanence, to meet suffering with compassion, and to embrace life with the clarity that only comes when we finally accept its brevity. The Buddha himself spoke of aging often. In fact, it was the sight of an old man, bent and weary, that shook young Siddhartha's world and ignited his search for truth. He saw what most of us refuse to see. That time spares no one. Not kings, not warriors, not poets. And in that revelation he found freedom. You see, suffering is born not from aging itself, but from our refusal to accept it. The fear of wrinkles, of weakness, of forgetting, of goodbyes, these are the second arrows we fire into our own hearts. But when we stop fighting the inevitable, when we cease clinging to what must, by nature, slip away, we find something unexpected. A peace that isn't dependent on youth or strength. A joy that no longer needs to be loud or grand. It's the kind of peace you feel sitting under an ancient tree, watching the leaves fall without protest. Each leaf returning to the earth, unafraid, knowing it was never separate to begin with. In this video, we'll take a quiet journey through the wisdom of Buddhist teachings on aging. Not as mere philosophy, but as a lived experience. A practical, tender, sometimes bittersweet roadmap to grow older not with fear, but with grace. We'll explore what it means to accept change without bitterness, to endure pain without multiplying it with unnecessary suffering, to loosen the grip of ego and realize we are far more connected to others and to this moment than we ever believed. We'll talk about how to prepare, not just for death, but for the art of living well in the years that precede it. Because aging, in truth, is not the opposite of youth. It is the deepening of life's great conversation. And perhaps, if we listen closely enough, it's where the most beautiful things are finally spoken. So, wherever you are in your journey, whether you feel the first whispers of age or find yourself long past them, this is a space for you. A gentle place to breathe, to remember what matters, and to discover that even as our bodies wither, our hearts can bloom in ways they never could before. As we begin this exploration, let's pause for a moment. Close your eyes if you can. Feel the quiet pulse of your own life, the rise and fall of your breath. Each breath a reminder that you are here, alive, and that in itself is a miracle. Aging isn't a punishment, it's a teacher. And every wrinkle, every ache, every forgotten name is a lesson waiting to be received. Not with fear, but with open hands. Let's walk this path together. Now listen closely. There's a truth you've felt but perhaps never named. That everything you've ever loved, everyone you've ever known, and even you are part of a world in constant motion. Nothing stays. But in that flowing river of impermanence lies the key to peace. And that is where we begin. They say the only thing certain in life is uncertainty. And yet, we spend so much of our lives clinging to what we wish would stay the same. We hold on to faces in photographs. We mourn the homes we've left behind. We resist the shifting of seasons, both in the world around us and within ourselves. But the ancient wisdom of Buddhism offers us a gentle, unflinching truth. Everything changes. And it's not a curse. It's the nature of life itself. The Buddha called this anicca, impermanence, a force as constant as gravity, moving through every breath, every relationship, every fleeting moment of joy and sorrow. We live in a world where mountains crumble, rivers shift their course, and stars are born only to one day disappear. And yet, when a wrinkle appears or a loved one drifts away, we're surprised, as though we'd been promised otherwise. But here's the quiet wisdom no one told you as a child. Nothing you see, hear, or hold will last forever. And far from being tragic, that truth can be profoundly liberating. Because once we stop trying to trap time in our hands, we learn how to truly live. The beauty of a sunset lies in its impermanence. The tenderness of a goodbye lingers because it was never meant to be forever. And the moments we remember most vividly are those we knew, even as they happened, could never come again. The Buddha taught that our suffering comes not from change itself, but from our resistance to it. It's like trying to grasp water. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips away. But when you open your hands, you realize the river was never meant to be held. It was meant to be witnessed, to be experienced, and then to let go. As we age, this wisdom becomes not just philosophical but deeply personal. The hair turns white, the back bends. The people we once relied on grow distant or disappear, and with every loss we're faced with a choice, to mourn what's gone or to embrace what remains. Buddhism invites us to see aging not as a process of decay, but as a natural unfolding, a transformation like the seasons turning. The cherry blossom blooms brilliantly, not in spite of its short life, but because of it. When we accept impermanence, we begin to treasure things differently. A simple conversation, a quiet morning, the sound of rain against an old window pane. These are not small moments, they are life itself. And for those of us walking the path of age, impermanence becomes a sacred teacher. It strips away what is unessential. The endless striving, the anxious comparisons, the regrets over what could have been. It leaves behind only what matters. Kindness, presence, simplicity. And perhaps this is the secret the young cannot yet grasp, that in letting go, we gain more than we lose. Consider this. The most peaceful people you've met weren't clinging to their youth or wealth or titles. They were the ones who had made peace with change, who smiled at each new wrinkle as a marker of life well lived, who held their memories gently, knowing even those would one day fade. This acceptance is not passivity. It's not giving up. It's choosing to meet life as it is, rather than how we wish it to be. And from that acceptance grows a new kind of strength. The strength to love without attachment, to live without fear, to grieve without drowning, and to age with grace. So, as you sit in this moment, whether the mirror reflects the flush of youth or the quiet dignity of age, remember this: nothing you cling to will stay. And that's not a reason for sorrow. It's a reason to be fully alive, to taste your food more slowly, to hold your loved ones a little longer, to forgive sooner than you planned, and to wake each day knowing this could be the one you'll miss when it's gone. Impermanence teaches us to stop postponing our lives, to stop waiting for some perfect, imagined future. Because in truth, the only time we've ever had is now. The Buddha once asked, if we could only truly grasp the brevity of this life, would we waste a single moment of it in anger or envy? Would you take a breath, feel the pulse in your chest? That is the sound of impermanence at work, and it is beautiful. And somewhere in this quiet acceptance, something begins to shift. The world no longer feels hostile. Change no longer feels cruel. You start to see it for what it is, a natural, continuous unfolding. And as you lean into that unfolding, you begin to notice a new kind of wisdom arising within you. A wisdom not born from books or titles, but from lived experience, from a heart softened by loss and opened by love. And it's here, in this tender space, that the path ahead reveals itself, a way to ease the weight of suffering, a way to find clarity amid uncertainty, a way to turn impermanence from an enemy into a friend. Shall we keep walking? There's something important we need to talk about next, the truth about suffering, and why we make it heavier than it needs to be. There's a moment, somewhere along this path of aging and change, when we realize it isn't always the pain itself that hurts the most. It's what we do with it. It's what we tell ourselves after the pain arrives. The Buddha, in his quiet brilliance, spoke of this over 2,500 years ago. He called it the parable of the second arrow. Imagine this: you're walking through a forest. The day is quiet, the sun warm on your back. And then out of nowhere, an arrow strikes your arm. It hurts, of course. There's shock, there's blood, there's pain. But then before you've even caught your breath, you pick up another arrow. And this one you drive into your own heart. This second arrow isn't made of wood or steel. It's made of thoughts, of judgments, of regrets. Why me? I shouldn't have come this way. This always happens to me. Now everything is ruined. And so what began as simple, inevitable pain becomes layered with suffering, a wound inside a wound. You see, life guarantees us the first arrow. We'll lose people we love, our bodies will ache, plans will crumble, disappointments will come. But the second arrow, that one we fire ourselves. And aging, with its gradual losses and transformations, is fertile ground for second arrows. When a new pain appears in the body, we don't just feel it. We fear what it means. Is this the beginning of the end? Will I be a burden now? When a friend forgets to call, it isn't only loneliness we feel. It's the story we weave around it. No one cares about me anymore. I'm disappearing. The Buddha's teaching is achingly simple. Pain is part of life, but suffering is optional. Because while we can't always stop the first arrow, we don't have to shoot the second. So how do we lay down that second arrow? How do we meet life's inevitable pains without multiplying them? It begins with awareness. When something hurts physically, emotionally, pause. Notice the sensation. Is it sharp, dull, heavy? Let it be just what it is, without the swirl of story. The ache in your back isn't a sign of your worth. The silence of a phone isn't a declaration of your value. It's just what's happening. And in that simple noticing, you create space. Space between the event and your reaction, between the pain and your story about it. And in that space, there's freedom. Buddhist mindfulness teaches us to become intimate with our present moment experience, not to escape it, not to numb it, but to befriend it, to notice this is pain. Not this pain means my life is over. To acknowledge this is loneliness. Not this proves no one loves me. To see the first arrow and refuse to fire the second. It takes practice. And some days you'll forget. You'll catch yourself deep in old stories, ancient fears. That's all right. Even in noticing that you've picked up the second arrow, you've already begun to drop it. And as you age, you may find that this wisdom becomes not just useful but essential. The body will carry aches. The heart will carry losses. But your mind, your beautiful, resilient, spacious mind, can remain clear, light, and gentle. And from that place, even pain loses its sharpest edge. There's a quiet power in choosing not to suffer unnecessarily. It's an act of rebellion against a world that profits from our fears. An act of compassion toward ourselves. Because no one escapes the arrows of life, but anyone can learn to stop firing the second. So the next time discomfort comes, whether in your joints or your heart, remember this ancient wisdom. Pause, notice, breathe, and ask yourself, is this the first arrow or the second? And if it's the second, set it down. There's a certain kind of clarity that arises when we stop believing every story the mind tells us, a lightness, a resilience. And from that lightness, something else quietly appears, the possibility of peace. Not because life has stopped hurting, but because you've stopped adding to the hurt. And once you've tasted that, you'll find yourself curious about what other burdens you've been carrying unnecessarily. Which brings us, quite naturally, to another timeless teaching, one that can help us move through these later years not just with wisdom, but with grace. Let's continue. If there's one illusion that clings to us the longest, it's the idea that we are separate, a single, isolated self moving through a world of others, a name, a body, a history, a me. But what if, like so many things, this too was a story? One more second arrow we've carried for too long. The Vietnamese Zen master, Thich Nh letter 1ea5t, H letter 1ea1nh, called it interbeing. A word so simple, and yet it carries the wisdom of lifetimes. To interbe means to see that you do not exist alone. You have never existed alone. Your breath is the breath of the trees. Your body, made of soil, rain, and sunlight. Your joys and fears shaped by countless ancestors, by the kindness of strangers, by ancient stars. You are not a wave, separate and small. You are the ocean, momentarily rising as this form, before returning again. And when aging visits our doorstep, when lines trace our skin and loved ones slip into memory, this truth becomes more precious than ever. Because the fear of aging isn't just about pain, it's about isolation, the creeping belief that we are fading, being forgotten, becoming irrelevant. But interbeing whispers a softer truth. You are woven into everything. Your touch on a child's hair, the meals you've shared, the stories you've told, the kindnesses no one saw but that changed someone's day. Long after your name is spoken, those ripples move outward. A laugh you sparked becomes a story a grandchild tells. A moment of patience alters a stranger's future. Nothing you have ever done, or loved, or touched is lost. And in recognizing this, something extraordinary happens. The fear of disappearing softens, because how can you disappear when you were never separate to begin with? This is the deep gift of interbeing. It turns aging from a shrinking into an expanding. You stop clinging to what you cannot keep, titles, roles, the illusion of control, and begin noticing how vast you truly are. You are the mother's lullaby still sung 100 years later. You are the rain nourishing tomorrow's harvest. You are the wisdom in a friend's heart, born from a conversation long past. And in this realization, aging becomes less of a loss and more of a return to the greater whole. In Buddhist practice, this insight isn't meant to be a poetic comfort. It's a lived, felt experience. Sit quietly, notice your breath, feel how it comes not from you but through you. A gift from the trees, the wind, the invisible weave of existence. Notice the warmth of your skin borrowed from the sun, the blood in your veins born of the earth. You are not this fragile, separate self. You are relationship. You are connection. And because of that, nothing is ever truly lost. Aging then is not the breaking of you, but the soft dissolving of the illusion that you were ever alone. It allows you to hold the hands of those you love without the desperate clutch of fear. It lets you release roles and titles without losing your worth. It reminds you that your legacy was never about monuments or fame, but about the quiet, invisible ways you shaped the world, the smile you offered, the forgiveness you chose, the tree you planted, the hand you held. These are the threads of interbeing. And in old age, as the body slows and the outer world shifts, this truth waits like a gentle lamp in the night. When loneliness visits, it reminds you. You are not alone. When fear whispers, it answers. Nothing is ever truly gone. When identity crumbles, it sings. You were always more than this name, this face, this fleeting moment. And as you rest in this truth, peace rises quietly like dawn, not because life stops changing, but because you've stopped resisting your place within it, because you've remembered, you are the rain, you are the soil, you are the laughter of a child not yet born. And so this aging body is not your prison, it is your gateway, an invitation to dissolve into something vaster, kinder, timeless. And in that timeless space there is no fear, only belonging. As you rest in this awareness, a new kind of courage begins to bloom. A readiness not just to let go, but to love what is. And as we move forward on this path, another essential wisdom calls us. A teaching not about fading away, but about releasing what no longer serves so the heart can remain light. Let's keep walking, There comes a moment in every life when you realize that the things you hold onto the tightest are often the very things weighing you down. We gather so much along the way, stories about who we're supposed to be, roles we inherit, wounds we protect, expectations we try to meet. We cling to them as if they're life rafts, believing without them we might drown in the vastness of what we don't know. But the Buddha taught something both unsettling and deeply liberating. That suffering isn't born from what happens to us. It's born from our clinging, our unwillingness to release what no longer serves us, our stubborn grip on identities, relationships, possessions, even ideas. We clutch titles, mother, teacher, leader, youthful, respected. And when time begins to erase them, when the mirror offers a new reflection, when life shifts its rhythms, the suffering isn't in the change itself. It's in our refusal to let go. But here's the paradox. In letting go, we lose nothing essential. In fact, we gain everything we've longed for: freedom, peace, the quiet, spacious joy that lives beneath all the noise. This path of release isn't about detachment in the cold, emotionless sense. It's about loving fully and then allowing things to move as they must, like leaves falling in autumn, beautiful, necessary, natural. Buddhist wisdom calls it non-attachment, and it's one of the hardest, most beautiful practices a person can undertake, because it asks us to trust that we are enough, even without the roles we played, to trust that life will continue, even when we release what once felt essential, to trust that what is meant to remain will, and what is meant to pass must. It invites us to loosen our grip on grudges, on regret, on the endless pursuit of things meant to fill the unfillable. And in this letting go, something astonishing happens. The heart softens. The body feels lighter. Laughter comes more easily. Memories no longer ache with what's lost, but shimmer with gratitude for what was. You realize you can grieve without drowning. You can remember without clinging. You can age without fear. Because freedom isn't found in holding on. It's found in surrender. This is not weakness. It is the courage of the wise, the bravery of those who have seen enough of life to know what cannot be controlled and no longer wish to try. There's a tenderness in this, a kind of quiet grace. When you no longer fight to preserve a fixed idea of who you are, you become more yourself than ever. Not the rigid, polished self you presented to the world, but the deeper, wilder, truer one, the self that has always existed beneath the masks. A self unafraid to age, unafraid to be forgotten, unafraid to love things you cannot keep. You'll notice it in the simple moments. When you look at an old photograph and smile without the sharp ache of nostalgia. When you let a conversation end, not chasing closure. When you wake to a new ache in your bones and greet it like an old friend rather than an enemy. This is the freedom of letting go. A freedom so wide, it no longer clings to freedom itself. It lets you belong to the present moment, unburdened by the past or the grasping for the future. It lets you love a person, not because they complete you, but because you have space within you. It lets you see aging not as a thief, but as a teacher, one who shows you, gently and insistently, what truly matters. And what matters is rarely what we thought. Not the titles, not the things, not the opinions of others, but the simple, transient joys, a cool breeze through an open window, the warmth of a hand on yours, the hush before dawn, the peace of knowing you need nothing more than this. As you travel this path, you'll see. Letting go isn't a single moment, it's a practice. 1,000 tiny surrenders, a willingness to release again and again. And every time you do, the world becomes a little wider, your heart a little softer, your presence a little deeper. And from this place, aging ceases to be a slow erosion. It becomes a gradual, sacred unfurling. A return not to nothing but to everything. And so, as the days stretch before us, there's one more truth waiting quietly in the wings. A teaching not of what we lose, but of what we carry, and how that unseen inheritance shapes not only our lives, but the lives that follow. Let's walk toward it. As we walk further along this path, one truth grows clearer with every step. That aging isn't a curse. It's a calling, an invitation to live with greater care and to die with grace. For what is life if not a preparation for death? Not in some somber, fearful way, but as a sacred rehearsal for the final release. Buddhist wisdom teaches us that the way we live shapes the way we leave, and the way we leave leaves an imprint on the world we depart. It's said that those who live mindfully, ethically, with compassion, die not with regret, but with a soft smile, because the truth is death is not a failure. It is the most natural of things, a moment every being is destined to meet. And yet, most of us live as though we'll outrun it. We speak of aging as though it's something we battle. We decorate ourselves in illusions of permanence, believing that perhaps if we refuse to name it, the end might forget to come for us. But here's the beautiful paradox. To truly live is to live with death in view, not as a shadow lurking, but as a gentle teacher walking beside you, reminding you what truly matters. When you remember that time is finite, that every hello carries within it the seed of a goodbye, you begin to live differently. You speak kinder words. You let go of petty grievances. You cherish ordinary mornings. You forgive yourself for old mistakes. You stop waiting for the perfect moment and live this one. This is what Buddhism calls ethical living, not as a burden of rules, but as a tender responsibility. It's choosing right speech, right action, right livelihood, not because some God demands it, but because it is the natural expression of a heart that remembers its impermanence. When you know the clock is ticking, you waste fewer words on anger. You spend more time in silence under trees, listening to birdsong, and slowly something shifts inside you. The fear of death begins to loosen. You stop clutching at life as if it owes you something, and you start seeing it as a gift already given. You realize the final journey isn't terrifying when you've made peace with yourself, when you've lived in a way that left no debt of kindness unpaid, no apology unsaid, no love withheld. The great masters spoke often of preparing for death, not by obsessing over it, but by practicing mindful dying every day, letting old versions of yourself die, letting expectations fall away, letting attachments dissolve, learning to meet each ending a relationship, a season, a breath, with gratitude and grace, because death is not an enemy. It is the most honest mirror. It reveals what truly mattered all along. The Buddha's final words were not of fear, but of gentle instruction. All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on diligently, a reminder that nothing lasts. And because nothing lasts, we are free, free to live unburdened, free to love deeply, free to leave when it is time. Without clinging, without regret, aging then becomes less of a slow loss, and more of a sacred preparation. Each wrinkle a reminder, each farewell a lesson, each ache in your bones a signal, not of decline, but of ripening, a readiness. And when the final journey comes, when your breath grows shallow, and the world blurs at the edges, may it find you not in resistance, but in quiet acceptance. May it find you surrounded by the warmth of a life lived fully, by the peace of unspoken kindnesses given freely, by the serenity of one who long ago stopped trying to control what was never theirs. This is the art of mindful death, not as a tragic end, but as a final offering, and in that offering, a quiet wisdom whispers, you were never this body, you were never these years, you were the awareness moving through it all. And so you'll leave as you came, weightless, formless, free. But before that moment comes, there's one last chapter waiting, a reflection not on endings, but on what lingers long after we've gone, the unseen legacies we leave in the hearts of others, the quiet imprints we make upon the world, and in those gentle echoes, we live on. And so we arrive at the quiet end of this winding path, not with a grand finale, not with fireworks or final answers, but with a deep, abiding stillness, a place within you that has been here all along, waiting. This is the eternal calm, not the absence of sorrow, not a life untouched by grief, but the unshakable peace beneath it all. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that aging, illness, loss, and death are not mistakes in the design. They are the very fabric of our existence, threads woven into the cloth of being. We are born into this world not to escape suffering, but to understand it, to meet it fully, to walk through it and come out the other side with softer eyes and a heart wide enough to hold it all. And when we do, we realize peace was never something to be found. It was what remained when all the noise fell away. The stories of youth and success, the anxious grasping at permanence, the illusion of a separate self, all of it slowly dissolving into the great river of time. What's left is simplicity, a morning sky brushed with gentle light, the warmth of tea between weathered hands, the hush of evening rain, the kindness of a glance, the softness of your own breath. These ordinary fleeting things, they are eternity dressed in modest clothes, and in learning to cherish them, to bow to both their beauty and their impermanence, we discover the secret all sages knew, that a peaceful life is not built by avoiding storms, but by learning to be still in their midst, to smile through uncertainty, to love without ownership, to let go not in despair but in reverence, because to grow old is a privilege, to face loss is a proof of having loved, and to approach death with open arms is to return to the great mystery from which we came. You see, this body you wear, it will fall away. This name you carry, it will be forgotten. But the goodness you've planted, the compassion you've shown, the moments of presence you've gifted the world, those are eternal, not in monuments or history books, but in the quiet ripple of lives touched, in the softened hearts of those you leave behind, in the earth that remembers your footsteps, in the sky that holds your final breath. And when that last moment comes, when you release this body, this story, this name, may it be with no resistance, no fear, only gratitude, a life fully lived, a journey completed, a return to the vastness. The Buddha taught that in seeing the nature of all things we find peace, in letting go of the illusion of control we discover freedom, and in meeting the inevitability of death, we learn at last how to truly live. So wherever you are now, in the rising years of youth, the middle stretch of burdens, or the quiet evenings of old age, know this: there is nothing to fear, nothing to cling to, and nothing to lose. You are not the lines on your face, not the number of breaths you've taken. You are the awareness moving through it all, and that awareness, boundless, formless, timeless, is the eternal calm. So take this moment now, to breathe, to soften your gaze, to feel the gentle pulse of life moving within and around you. Let it be enough. Let it be everything. And when you rise from this listening, may you carry this peace with you, in every step, in every word, in every fading sunset, until the final one. This has been our journey together. May it serve you well. May it soften your heart. And may it remind you always that peace was never somewhere else. It was here within you all along. Thank you for walking this path with me.